Ironically, I spent 15 years helping corporations find where the money went. I traced phantom invoices, flagged shell companies, rebuilt balance sheets that had been deliberately shredded. I was very good at following the paper trail, which made it all the more embarrassing that it took me until I was 38 years old to look at my own family's finances and realize I had been the target the entire time. Let me back up. My mother died when I was 9. A car accident on I-90 January black ice. My father remarried 14 months later, which, looking back, tells you everything you need to know about the man. Her name was Lynette. She came with a son from her first marriage, a boy 2 years older than me named Garrett, and from the moment she moved into our house in Naperville, Illinois, I understood that the space I occupied in that home had fundamentally changed. I don't want to make this sound like a fairy tale. Lynette wasn't cartoonishly cruel. She didn't lock me in a basement or make me scrub floors. It was quieter than that and somehow worse. She had a way of making me feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My things were moved to make room for Garrett's. My mother's photographs disappeared from the living room, just getting them framed properly, my father said, and they never came back. At dinner, conversation started and finished without me. When I tried to join in, Lynette would look at me with this particular expression, patient and a little tired, like I was a child who kept interrupting the adults. My father let it happen. That is the thing I have spent the most time making peace with. When I was 20, I left for the University of Illinois at Chicago on a partial scholarship and a lot of determination. I told myself it was ambition. Truthfully, I just needed to get out of that house before I stopped recognizing myself entirely. I studied accounting because numbers made sense to me in a way that people often didn't. I graduated, got my CPA, found a position at a mid-sized forensic accounting firm in Chicago, and spent the next decade building a life that had nothing to do with Naperville or my father or Lynette and Garrett. I was doing fine. More than fine, actually. I had a good apartment in Lincoln Park, a job I was proud of, a small circle of people I trusted. I had learned how to be alone without being lonely, which I think is one of the harder skills a person can develop. Then my father called. I almost didn't answer. We spoke maybe 3 or 4 times a year, holidays, the occasional birthday, conversations that lasted exactly as long as they needed to and not 1 minute more. But it was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was between meetings, and I picked up. Sylvie. He sounded different. Older, and something else I couldn't name yet. I need you to come home, there are some things we need to go over together, as a family. I asked him what kind of things. Legal things, he said. Your grandfather's estate. My grandfather, my mother's father, had passed away the previous autumn at 81, after a long illness. He and I had stayed close after my mother died. He was the one who came to my school plays, who remembered my birthday without being reminded, who drove 2 hours to Chicago to take me to lunch when I got my CPA. When he passed, I grieved him in that specific quiet way you grieve the last person who carries a version of you that no one else holds. He had left me something. I knew that much. He had mentioned it once, carefully, without going into details. He said he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I had thanked him and changed the subject because it felt too close to talking about him dying, and I wasn't ready for that. So when my father said, "Your grandfather's estate," I understood there was a reason for this sudden family meeting. I drove down to Naperville on a Saturday morning. The house looked the same. There is something disorienting about a place that doesn't change even when everything inside it has. My father met me at the door, and I noticed he looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep. Lynette was in the kitchen. Garrett was at the dining room table with his laptop open, and when he looked up at me, he smiled in that easy way of his that I had never quite learned to trust. "Sylvie," he said. "Good to see you." We sat around the dining room table, all 4 of us, and my father slid a manila envelope across to me. "Your grandfather left you a bequest," he said. "In addition to the general estate, there was a separate account held in trust since your mother passed. For you. But there are some tax documents that need to be signed in order to finalize the transfer." I looked at the envelope. "Tax documents," I said. "Standard stuff," Garrett said, and he had this tone, practiced and casual, like he was explaining something simple to someone slow. "Just some forms clarifying the transfer of assets and the associated liability. You sign, the estate closes, you get your money." I picked up the envelope. Something in my chest was very still. "Can I take these with me to review?" There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But I have spent my career inside pauses like that, and I know what they mean. "Of course," my father said, a half beat too late. Lynette came in from the kitchen carrying a coffee tray. She set mugs in front of everyone and smiled at me with all her teeth. "It's so nice to have you here," she said. "You should come home more often, Sylvie." I drove back to Chicago with the envelope on the passenger seat. I did not open it until I was in my apartment at my kitchen table with a glass of water and the overhead light on. It took me about 20 minutes to understand what I was looking at. The documents were not standard tax forms. They were buried under a very convincing layer of IRS-adjacent language, a relinquishment of beneficiary rights. If I signed these papers, I would be surrendering my claim not just to whatever account my grandfather had left me directly, but to a secondary trust, one I had not known existed, that had been established by my grandfather specifically in my name in 2001, 2 years after my mother died. I sat very still for a while. Then I called the only person I trusted with something like this. My colleague Darnell, who had been my work partner for 6 years, and who had over that time become one of my closest friends. He was a forensic accountant too, and he had a sharper instinct for financial fraud than anyone else I knew. "Don't sign anything," he said before I had even finished explaining. "I know. How much are we talking about?" "I don't know yet. The documents don't specify an amount, which is itself." "Yeah," he said. "That's itself a thing." We started looking the next morning. What we found over the following 3 weeks was this. My grandfather had established the trust in 2001 with an initial deposit of $180,000, money from the sale of a piece of property he had owned in Wisconsin. The trust was designed to mature when I turned 35, at which point the full amount, plus 3 decades of compound interest, would transfer to me automatically. My grandfather had named an independent trustee, a family attorney named Mr. Abernathy, who had since retired and passed on administration to a junior partner at his firm. Except that somewhere around 2009, the trust's investment account had been quietly restructured. New signatures appeared on file. The independent trustee had been replaced, not officially, not through any court order, but through a series of internal administrative changes that, if you didn't know what you were looking for, looked like routine paperwork. The person who had been managing the trust's assets since 2009 was my father. I had turned 35 the previous November. The trust should have transferred to me automatically. It hadn't. There had been, instead, a series of disbursements, withdrawals technically, coded as administrative fees and estate management costs, that had reduced the account balance from its projected value of approximately $340,000 down to just under $22,000. $318,000 gone. Over 14 years. Small enough withdrawals each time that no single one would trigger an automatic audit. Regular enough to look like maintenance. Irregular enough that no pattern would be immediately obvious to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. My father had been very careful, but he hadn't been careful enough. I sat at my kitchen table the night Darnell and I confirmed what we were looking at, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I would feel rage. Instead, I felt something colder and more clarifying, the particular focus that comes when you stop being a person in a situation and become a professional examining evidence. I was very good at this job. I had spent 15 years getting good at it. I called a probate attorney in Chicago named Ms. Harrington, who came highly recommended, and who, when I walked her through everything, went very quiet and then said in a careful voice, "You have a strong case." I asked her what strong meant. She said, "It means you should file." We filed a civil complaint in Cook County Probate Court. The claim was breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trust assets, and fraudulent concealment. The documentation I had was, as Ms. Harrington put it, unusually thorough, because I had done my own audit before we ever walked into a courthouse, and I had been meticulous. My father's attorney called 2 days after the filing. He wanted to discuss a settlement. I told Ms. Harrington to tell them I would discuss it at mediation, through proper channels and not before. What happened next I only know in pieces, because I was not in the room for most of it. But Ms. Harrington told me afterward that when my father's team finally reviewed the full scope of the forensic audit I had prepared, the room went quiet in a way that she said she would remember for a long time. Garrett called me. This surprised me. I hadn't expected him to be the one. He didn't apologize exactly, but there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before. A kind of deflation, he said. "I didn't know it was that much, Sylvie. I want you to know that." I said I appreciated him telling me. He said, "Is there anything that would make this easier?" I said, "Your stepfather returning the money would make it easier." He didn't say anything to that. The mediation took place in April in a conference room in the Loop that overlooked Lake Michigan on a gray, choppy day. My father came in looking smaller than I remembered. Lynette was not there. I don't know whose decision that was. He sat across from me for the first time since that Saturday in Naperville, and I watched him look at the table, rather than at me. And I thought about the 9-year-old girl who used to follow him around the backyard on summer evenings, handing him tools while he worked on the car. The settlement agreement required my father to repay the full amount misappropriated from the trust, with interest, totaling $341. He also agreed to a court-supervised repayment plan and a formal acknowledgement of breach of fiduciary duty that would become part of the public record. He avoided criminal prosecution. Miss Harrington and I had discussed this, and I had ultimately decided that a civil resolution was what I wanted. Not out of mercy exactly, more because I wanted the money my grandfather intended for me. That mattered more to me than watching my father in a courtroom. What I did not anticipate was what came after the mediation. When I got back to my car that afternoon, I sat in the parking garage for a while with the engine off. I had expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, I felt the particular exhaustion that comes after something that has required you to be precise and controlled for a very long time. I thought about my grandfather, about the Tuesday mornings he would call me just to hear my voice, about the way he said my name, Sylvie, 2 syllables, like it was enough. He had put that money away for me in 2001, because he understood, even then, that my mother was gone and I was going to need something solid to stand on. He couldn't have known what would happen to it. But he had tried. I thought about that the whole drive back up to Chicago. The trust funds transferred to my account in June. I didn't do anything dramatic with the money. I paid off the remainder of my student loans, which were modest. I put the rest into a savings account and let it sit while I figured out what I wanted. There's a particular feeling that comes with money that was fought for, as opposed to money that was simply earned. It carries weight in a different way. I found I didn't want to spend it quickly. I wanted to be thoughtful about it. I haven't spoken to my father since the mediation. I don't know that I will. I've thought a lot about whether that makes me a cold person, and I've decided it doesn't. I think it makes me someone who finally understood, at 38, that you can love a parent and still refuse to let that love become a way for them to keep taking from you. Garrett and I exchanged a few texts in the months after, nothing significant, but last Christmas he sent me a card, an actual paper card, mailed to my apartment, and inside he had written just, "I'm sorry it happened this way." I put the card on my refrigerator for a while. I didn't throw it away. My grandfather left me more than money. He left me the evidence, hidden in plain sight inside a trust document, that someone had believed I was worth protecting. When the people who were supposed to protect me chose not to, I learned how to do it myself. That turns out to be the more valuable inheritance.